Genetically, what modern population is closest to Proto-Semites? What modern population is closest to the Proto-Semitic population of the past? The best evidence for the first Proto-Afro-Asiatic people are the Natufians, and Proto-Semites would be descending from Natufians. From a Y DNA chromosome perspective, Proto-Afro-Asiatic people carried haplogroup E, and most modern Afro-Asiatic people still carry haplogroup E. And likewise, the Natufians also carried haplogroup E. Furthermore, logically speaking, Proto-Semitic populations would also have to carry haplogroup E. This is from Cambridge, and it reads, given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebelite and Akkadian early Semitic languages are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. This is from Y-chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origins of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism. So here's the area of Natufian culture, which overlaps perfectly with the area of Proto-Semites, because Proto-Semites would descend from the Natufians. Therefore, they'll both logically be in the same geographical area, the Levant, because the Natufians represent an ancestral population to the Semites. This paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant, that is, from in hot pursuit of language and prehistory. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y-chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. That is from Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus revealed core of West Eurasian ancestry. Natufians would be the first to domesticate animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle. They would even be the world's first agriculturalists and would have practiced early pastoralism and farming, as well as built human settlements and created the first true societies, all while using Proto-Afro-Asiatic terms that will be developing throughout time. This is from the Natufian culture in the Levant threshold to the origins of agriculture, and it reads, data has led to the recognition that a Natufian homeland existed in the central Levant, and that the Natufians were secondary foragers and perhaps the earliest farmers. This information had led to the recognition that the Natufian culture played a major role in the emergence of the early Neolithic farming communities, or what is known as the agricultural revolution. So this is the area of Natufian culture. You have the Harifian culture right here. You have the early Natufian homeland, which is right here in Israel. And then you have the late Natufian, which extends from Israel all the way up into modern day Syria. So this is basically the area of Natufian homeland and culture, and where this agricultural revolution will begin. This is from the book The Winds of Change, and it reads, the Natufians were a Neolithic culture that extended from modern-day Israel to southeastern Turkey, and around 11,500 years ago, they were among the first peoples to start cultivating grain and domesticating cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs in this landscape, which varied from Mediterranean woodland and scrubland and the steppe. This is from the Prehistory of a Dispersal, the Proto-Afrosan Afroasiatic Farming Lexicon, and it reads, the identification of Proto-Afrosans as Natufians and post-Natufians seems to satisfy all the four criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are sets of reconstructed Proto-Afrosan terms pointing to incipient animal breeding, a wide variety of dwelling and settlement types, a territory characterized by both desert and steep forest type of terrain and drying riverbeds as well as deep permanent streams, a vegetation typical of such terrain, and the animals whose bones have been found at the Natufian and early Neolithic post-Natufian sites. Interestingly, there is a large number of common Afrosan terms denoting flocked gullet animals, usually inhabiting steppe and semi-deserts. Finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where population began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia, but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean and Africa. So, from the Natufians would spawn the Harifian and the PPN, or pre-pottery Neolithic cultures of the Levant, which would all give rise to Proto-Semites. Harifian is a specialized regional cultural development of the Epipaleolithic of the Negev Desert. It corresponds to the latest stages of the Natufian culture. More recently, Jairus Zarins has suggested that the development of the Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex of cultures developed in the period of 6200 BCE, climactic crisis stretching from southern Palestine down the Red Sea shoreline and northeastward into Syria and Iraq, spreading Proto-Semitic languages through the region. This complex may have developed from the fusion of Harifian and pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures in southern Palestine. So Proto-Semites would have developed from the Harifians and pre-pottery Neolithic B in the Levant. And this two peoples, Harifians, pre-pottery Neolithic B, they all come from Natufians. This is the book, Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia, and it's going to talk about the area of the PPNB, the pre-pottery Neolithic B complex, and the Fertile Crescent. Where is it? The pre-pottery Neolithic B, the PPNB cultural manifestations appears to solidify and expand on the earlier tenuous steps towards mixed agriculture and perhaps were begun in the late Epipaleolithic and PPNA. Since its designation at Jericho by Kenyon, the sanitary aspects of the PPNB has been found in a large arc covering Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and Turkey. Recognizing the pattern, most archaeologists refer to a Levantine origin for this phenomenon. Moore suggests a concept called the Ancient Levant, which included substantially all of Syria, western Iraq, most of Jordan, and a portion of northern Saudi Arabia. The researchers at Pelria refer to PPNB sites there as part of the inland Levant. So basically, pre-pottery Neolithic culture It is a Levantine culture. It has its origin and its homeland within the Levant. Of course, the same homeland as the Natufians, and PPNB descends from Natufians, so that would make sense. So here is the area of the ancient Levant, these PPNB sites. And this is also the exact same geographical homeland of the Natufians. In summary, by 6200 BC, a recognizable PPNC culture had begun to penetrate the more marginal environments of the Near East, both south into the Negev and Sinai, and east of the Levant into Jordan and Saudi Arabia. In each succeeding period, the growth reliance on domesticated herds at the expense of farming and hunting and gathering can be documented, thus demonstrating the gradual but inexorable shift to specialized pastoralism. So we see that even in the year 6200 BC, with the PP&C culture, we're still in the Levant when it comes to farming and domesticating herds of animals, and it's starting to expand outwards. Again, around 6200 BC, the PP&C culture. So this is another great paper that's going to detail and deal with the origins of pastoralism and the origins of agriculture and its spread, and more importantly, who are the people, what was the population that did this. This paper is titled The Prehistory of Language from the Perspective of the Y chromosome. So it reads, the 2005 book First Farmers, The Origins of Agricultural Societies by Peter Bellwood provides an excellent resource for linguists who wish to explore the worldwide correlation between the origins of agriculture and the expansion of languages. In Chapter 3 of the book, he explores the origins of agriculture in Southwest Asia, focusing on a region often identified in the literature as the Fertile Crescent. This region encompasses parts of contemporary Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The transition to agriculture in the Fertile Crescent was facilitated by the domestication of cereal such as wheat and barley and legumes such as chickpeas and lentils from wild sources. Additionally, the agricultural transition in the Fertile Crescent involved the domestication of goats and sheep. The success of agriculture in Southwest Asia partly stems from improved climatic conditions following the last ice age. Another factor that ensued the success of this transformation was the development of pottery. Prior to the adoption of agriculture in Southwest Asia and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, the human tribe practiced hunter-gatherer techniques in order to survive. The evolution of agriculture in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begin with the Natufians, followed by the pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. The Natufians appeared near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. Bar Yosef 1998 paints a picture of everyday Natufian life which centered on the hunting of gazelle and other animals. Moreover, and more significantly, he reports that they practice intensive and extensive harvesting of wild cereal that were abundantly in the region at the time. According to the description provided by Bellwood in 2005, this abundant supply of food allowed the Natufians to construct semi-permanent settlements, something that is unusual for hunter-gatherers. This culture, these cultures were generally nomadic. People began to domesticate wild cereal and legumes that their Natufian ancestors had previously gathered. The pre-pottery Neolithic A culture stands as the initial Southwest Asian culture that embraced this new development. They and their descendants thrived, and by around 10,500 years ago, large farming settlements appeared, such as the one at Abu Harar in northern Syria. This development signaled the evolution of an cultural transition in the region. The PPNB, or the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture, one of the significant innovations that occurred during this period was the development of pastoralism, the herding of goats and sheep, which were once wild animals that people had managed to domesticate. About 9,000 years ago, the development of pottery ushered in a new cultural transition in Southwest Asia. This development allowed people to cook their food more efficiently and facilitated the storage of grain after harvesting. Around this time, the climate in Southwest Asia also became more arid. According to Bellwood in 2005, this change in climate was accompanied by deforestation that human settlements had brought, as well as less productive soil due to overfarming. These conditions caused many people in Southwest Asia to abandon sedentary crop culture. Instead of cultivating crops, some turned to sheep and goat herding as a food source. By around 6.4 thousand years ago, some of these Southwest Asian pastoralists herded their sheep and goats out of the region into Egypt. Peter Bellwood, in 2005, based on his interpretation of the archaeological data, suggests that Afro-Asiatic languages initially evolved in Southwest Asia and co-expanded out of this region with the spread of agriculture. Interestingly, linguistic data may also support this model of Afro-Asiatic origins. Using linguistic reconstruction, Maltarev in 2002 presents a Proto-Afro-Asiatic lexicon of farming terminology. Based on the reconstructions, he suggests that the Natufians, agriculture, and Afro-Asiatic co-evolved in Southwest Asia. Finally, another reason for identifying Southwest Asia as the punitive homeland of Afro-Asiatic languages is the Y-chromosome data as presented below in section 4 and 5. So, as we can see, one of the main things I want y'all to get is this, that the Natufians and agriculture and Afro-Asiatic, it all co-evolved. And of course, where was the Natufians, their geographical location? It was in the Levant. But also, it would seem like Y-DNA data also can even support this spreading of agriculture and Afro-Asiatic. So what would the Y-DNA be in that case? So pre-pottery Neolithic Levantines carried Y-DNA haplogroup E. This is from Genomic Insights into the Origin of Farming in the Ancient Near East, and it reads, a result that finds some support from Y chromosomes, which shows that the Natufians and successor Levantine Neolithic populations carried haplogroup E. So the Natufians and successor, which means their descendants of other Levantine Neolithic populations like PPNA, PPNB, PPNC, and the Harifians, carried haplogroup E. This finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Epi-Paleolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. So Neolithic and Epi-Paleolithic Levantine populations were dominated by haplogroup E. And it was these very populations that started to be the first Proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers, the first pastoralists, the first agriculturalists, the first farmers, the first people to domesticate sheep and animals. In the Levant, it would have been E markers. This is from ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. So here is just an example of that fact that E would have dominated the Levant. So here's the PPNB in Angazelle. Here are Natufian samples, and here is even a sample of E in Chalcolithic Turkey or Anatolia. Here's a sample of E in Chalcolithic northern Israel. So E was scattered all over the Levant, from Turkey to Israel. So Proto-Semites would descend from Harifian and pre-pottery Neolithic Levantines, and they descend from Natufians. If Proto-Semites descend from these populations, then they would carry haplogroup E. Like the Natufians, early Semites also practiced pastoralism and agriculture. Harifian has close connections with the late Mesolithic cultures of Phylum and the eastern deserts of Egypt, whose tool assemblage resembles that of the Harifian. Fusion with animal domestication elements of the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture is hypothesized by Jairus Zarins to have led to the Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex, a group of cultures that invented nomadic pastoralism, and may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic languages throughout the region. Again, Proto-Semites would be descending from these pre-pottery Neolithic cultures, and the pre-pottery Neolithic cultures themselves descend from the Natufians. So it's a straight line from the Natufians to PPNB to Harifian, and then to Proto-Semites. That is from the book Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlements of Lower Mesopotamia. And so here is basically a great example in terms of a map of what we're basically dealing with. We have the late Natufian / early PPNA, because that's who they're going to come from, is the Natufians. And then we have the Harifians, and it's all geographically within the Levant, stretching from Sinai all the way up to modern day Syria. And this is the exact same homeland. This is the exact same area where Proto-Semites would have their genesis from the Negev and Sinai all the way up into modern day Syria. They overlap each other because Proto-Semites come from Natufians, PP in A, B, and C cultures, and Harifians. And this is from the book Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlements of Lower Mesopotamia, Prehistoric Akkad. The sudden appearance of populations without any previous occupational history in the desert and steppe raises the question of ethnic and linguistic identity. The Semitic populations, identified as Akkadians, were pastoral groups who migrated from the western desert or the Hamda sometime within a proto-historic Mesopotamian context. And that's very important. So we see that these Semitic populations, like the Akkadians, they were early pastoral groups, and that they were in that general area of the Levant before they started to spread. The prehistoric occupational pattern, like that of historical time, suggests a strong pastoral Semitic presence interacting with the settled populations. So even in the prehistoric period and in the historical times, we see that there is a strong pastoral Semitic presence. Again, Proto-Semites, they were pastoralists, and this comes from their pre-pottery Neolithic ancestors, their Harifian ancestors, and their Natufian ancestors. The idea that Amorites, Arameans, and Arabs were essentially pastoral, nomadic Semitic people who invaded the plain has largely been accepted, perhaps based on the historical data extant for those populations. The crux of the matter in historical terms centers on the Akkadians. So Proto-Semites would originate in the Levant in 4000 BC and expand from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia in 3750 BC. This is from the paper titled Bayesian Phylogenetic Analysis of Semitic Languages Identifies an Early Bronze Age Origin of Semitic in the Near East. And it reads, our Semitic language phylogeny indicates that the initial divergence of ancestral Semitic into East and West Semitic was nearly coincidence by the divergence of West Semitic into Central and South Semitic around 5,300 years before present. The short interval between these two divergences and their overlapping HPDs suggests that both divergences may have occurred in the Northeast Levant. The distribution of ancient and modern Central and South Semitic languages is consistent with Central Semitic spreading westward throughout the Levant and South Semitic spreading southward from the Levant, eventually reaching southern Arabia. So we see that basically the Semitic languages have its origin within the Levant and it spread in all directions from the Levant into southern Arabia and into Mesopotamia. So the date of the Proto-Semitic people would have been in 4000 BC, as you can see down here, 4000 BC, 6000 years before present. And technically there's even an older Proto-Semitic language, I guess you can call it a pre-Proto-Semitic language, that goes back to 5000 BCE, 7000 years before present, which will be right here. But our main focus is the 6000 years before present for the Proto-Semitic language, which will be 4000 BC. And it's going to spread from the Levant, going into Mesopotamia, going throughout Arabia, and going deeper into Arabia, all the way even into Eastern Africa. So there is most definitely a Levantine origin, the exact same place where the Natufians were, where the pre-pottery Neolithic cultures were, where the Harifians were. This is where Proto-Semites are originating, and this is where Proto-Semites will expand from. Reading what's in yellow, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin, approximately 5,750 years before present in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Akkadians migrated from the Levant into Mesopotamia. Akkadians did not originate in Mesopotamia. I seem to hear that sometimes, but Akkadians didn't originate from Mesopotamia. They came from the Levant and migrated into Mesopotamia from the Levant. And this video will actually illustrate that very migration of Proto-Semites from the Levant into Mesopotamia and into Arabia. So check out this video, it's really good and I believe you'll like it. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. One of the oldest Semitic cities is Ebla. The first kingdom of Ebla existed in 3000 through 2000 BC. The Eblites spoke one of the oldest Semitic languages, part of the East Semitic. So Ebla is in modern-day Syria, by the way. Here is where it would be in northern Syria. So this book, Ebla and its landscape, it details the history of Ebla. Following the still obscure centuries in the history of the first urban formations in Mesopotamia, to which the virtually unknown and certainly limited settlement of Merdek I of the Proto-Historic period, circa 3500 through 3000 BC, dates back the true urban development of Ebla probably took place during the early dynastic 1 through 3 periods of Mesopotamia, corresponding to the age of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. In the still partly obscure phase of Merdek 3a, circa 3000 through 2400 BC, corresponding to the archaic early Syrian period, early Bronze Age 1 through 3. The first flourishing of Ebla took place during Merdek 2b1, the age of the royal archives, circa 2400 through 2300 BC, and the high early Syrian period, early Bronze Age 4a, corresponding to the last decades of the early dynastic 3b period. So basically, Ebla's old. It's really old. It goes back to the early Bronze Age and goes back to 3500 through 3000 BC. So Ebla, of course, is a Semitic language. This book, The Semitic Languages, until the discovery of the Ebla text, there was no reason to focus inquiry on the structure of East Semitic, since the only language assigned to this group was Akkadian, and Akkadian/East Semitic was what was left out of West Semitic. This treatment of Ebelite as a East Semitic sibling of Akkadian is compatible with that of Kablis, 1981, who suggests that Ebelite is neither Akkadian nor West Semitic, and that of Gleb, who suggests that the closest relative of Ebelite is Old Akkadian, without treating it as a dialect of Akkadian. So Ebelite is basically Old Akkadian. It's part of the East Semitic languages. It's, again, a very old language. So Ebla is important to us because it's one of the first and earliest Semitic kingdoms, and we can examine the remains of Ebla, which is great. And one of the oldest Y-DNA chromosomes we found in early Bronze Age Ebla is haplogroup E, which of course is associated with Afro-Asiatic languages. According to ancient DNA analysis conducted by Sok Tenori et al. 2020 on 10 human remains found at Tel Merdek, the individuals of the kingdom of Ebla were a mixture of Levantines, Iranians, and Anatolians. One early Bronze Age individual carried haplogroup E1b1b, a lineage closely linked to the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages. By the way, that early Bronze Age samples around 2700 through 2500 BC, and haplogroup E associated with the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages, which is true. Ebelite language, archaic Semitic language, probably the most ancient to survive in substantial form, dating from the third quarter of the third millennium BC as a northern Central Semitic language. Ebelite is affiliated with the Afro-Asiatic family of languages. Most of the Afro-Asiatic speakers share a lineage defined by Yap descendant called PN2/215/M35. So haplogroup E, Afro-Asiatics, it's all linked together. So it's likely that Ebla sample with E was a Proto-Semite. And here is that haplogroup E marker we found in Syria, 4,600 years before present through 3,800 years before present. This specific E sample is E-L795. So this Ebla sample from the early Bronze Age having haplogroup E, it makes sense. It's likely a Proto-Semite that descended from the Natufians of that same geographical area, the Levant. And the Natufians, of course, they carried haplogroup E. This is, pretty much confirms that when we analyze that Ebla early Middle Bronze Age sample, Ebla EMBA, early Middle Bronze Age sample, basically we found a sample that was genetically connected to Epipaleolithic to Bronze Age Southern Levantines, and the Epipaleolithic Southern Levantines would be Natufians. It says it right in this paper, in this section that's in yellow right here. Ebla early Middle Bronze Age are still distinct from the other Anatolian groups with respect to their connection to the ancient Southern Levant. So Ebla early Middle Bronze Age, they're distinct from Anatolian groups. They're not Anatolians. And again, this Ebla early Middle Bronze Age would be a Semite. Semites were not Anatolians. But this Ebla early Middle Bronze Age has connections to the ancient Southern Levant. So it says it again in the paper that Ebla early Middle Bronze Age requires a substantial contribution from ancient Southern Levantine populations. So Ebla early Bronze Age, early Middle Bronze Age requires a substantial contribution from the ancient Southern Levantine populations. So basically when it's talking about ancient Southern Levant, because maybe that might be a bit vague, so it's talking about Southern Levant Epipaleolithic through the Bronze Age. So from the Epipaleolithic through the Bronze Age, this is who that Ebla early Middle Bronze Age sample is basically genetically closest to. That's who they have a connection with. So what is the Epipaleolithic? In archaeology, the Epipaleolithic is a term for a period occurring between the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic during the Stone Age. Mesolithic also falls between these two periods, and the two are sometimes confused or used as synonymous. The Natufian culture is a late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant. So Natufians absolutely fall into that boat of the Epipaleolithic and the Levantine Epipaleolithic people. So the Ebla early Middle Bronze Age genetically had haplogroup E, and that's of course connected to Natufians, and that's essentially Natufian ancestry. This could even be extended to the Akkadians as well. It's actually believed that, unsampled remains in Mesopotamia can share the same genetics as the Ebla early Middle Bronze Age. Likely, those groups would be the Akkadians. You can see an interesting distribution, actually, of Levantine Neolithic ancestry in both Syria and Iraq. Furthermore, it is believed that Akkadians and early Semitic peoples carried haplogroup E. The migration of haplogroup E from the Levant into Mesopotamia fits perfectly. Again, just to remind you, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin 5,750 years before present in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. So with Semites already coming from the Levant in basically 4000 BC, makes sense why they'll have E markers, makes sense why they'll have basically Natufian ancestry. This is from the paper titled How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads, the most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration to the Fertile Crescent with TMRCAs fitting the arrival of the Akkadians and other early Semitic peoples like Ebla are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12 with relatively early TMRCAs present in the Middle East could be candidates for such remigration, such as E-FGC14382, TMRCAs 2200 BCE, and E-V3262, TMRCAs 2600 BCE. And here's a map that basically can show you a perfect example of that migration. So we see haplogroup E having its oldest markers within the Levant, and as haplogroup E expands outwards from the Levant, the E samples get younger. And this map also shows the same thing. E samples and Neolithic sites expanding outwards from the Levant, and the E samples, by the way, they get younger as they get more into Mesopotamia, and they get closer to the period of the Semites because these E markers are likely Semites. And just to remind you, Ebla early Middle Bronze Age requires a substantial contribution from ancient southern Levantine populations. So if we have Semites moving from the Levant into Mesopotamia, then we know why. And the Ebla sample has a lot of southern Levantine ancestry. Southern Levantine, that's basically Natufian. Again, Epipaleolithic through the Bronze Age. Southern Levant, Epipaleolithic through the Bronze Age with this Ebla sample of Semite. And remember, the Natufian culture is a late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant. A late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant. And just to bring this all together, taking the above into consideration, we suggest that the ancestries we inferred for Alalak and Ebla might best describe the genetic makeup of the early Bronze Age population of unsampled northern Mesopotamia. So basically, what's being believed here is that other populations, other early Bronze Age populations in Mesopotamia the unsampled ones, of course, they could also have the same genetic makeup of the people of Ebla. And that'll be interesting because basically they're saying that there could be other E markers in Mesopotamia, unsampled E markers, and unsampled populations with this ancient southern Levantine ancestry, like what that Ebla sample had. And basically, ancient southern Levantine ancestry would be that Natufian ancestry. And when we look at Ebla, and when we look at the Akkadians, keep in mind both of these are Semitic peoples, and these Akkadians would be other Mesopotamian peoples that we have yet to sample. We don't have any Akkadian samples yet, but it is likely that the Akkadians would genetically be no different than the people of Ebla, having haplogroup E and having Levantine ancestry, with them descending from southern Levantines. And actually, when we look at the distribution of Levantine Neolithic ancestry, we do see that Levantine Neolithic ancestry, of course, is highest in the Middle East, first of all, has a great percentage in the Levant because that's where it originates, but also expands into Syria and into Iraq, around the same area of the Ebla and Akkadian Empire. And it doesn't really go too much above modern day Turkey, Iran, or the Southern Caucasus. It pretty much stays within the countries of Syria and Iraq, which is mostly Semitic people. And it makes sense because Semites likely descend from these Neolithic Levantines, these pre-pottery Neolithic cultures that were the first farmers, agriculturalists, pastoralists, sheep herders, goat herders, etc. Again, same area where Semites pretty much stopped at, same geographical area. Syria and Iraq, everyone below that borderline, that it was like a natural border, because I assume that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that was a natural border in ancient times for the Semitic populations. They didn't really go above that area. And this is the same area where we don't see Levantine Neolithic ancestry go above, and this is the same area where we don't see Semites go above. So it all makes geographical sense and even genetic sense, all in the same region. I would argue when it comes to a Proto-Semite and an Afro-Asiatic, we are looking at three things. So, one, Y-DNA haplogroup E. Two, ancient southern Levant, Natufian slash Neolithic Levantine ancestry. And three, Ibero-Mauritian Neolithic North African ancestry. I would say those three components make up what a Proto-Semite, or just an Afro-Asiatic population in general, should have. With that being said, in order to figure out which modern population best represents early Proto-Semites, let's look at the distribution of Natufian ancestry, which is basically Afro-Asiatic ancestry, because that's the main question we're trying to ask ourselves. Who is a Proto-Semite today? So this is the distribution of Natufian ancestry. The Natufian culture, it was an epi-Paleolithic culture that existed from 12,500 to 9,500 BC in the Levant. The Natufians foraged for food such as murmur, wheat, barley, and almonds, and hunted gazelle, deer, cattle, horses, and wild boar. The direct descendants of the Natufian, known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic or PPN, were among the earliest farmers on the planet. So, just wanted to read that to remind you that the Natufians are very important to agriculture and as well as domesticating animals. So, the distribution of Natufian ancestry, which again I would say is basically Afro-Asiatic ancestry, is all over the Afro-Asiatic regions, from North Africa to East Africa to the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. And Natufian ancestry is highest in the Middle East. And again, it doesn't really go too much above Syria and Iraq, although there are some people who have it in Anatolia, Southern Caucasus, and Iran, but it's highest below Syria and Iraq, as we can clearly see. And this Natufian ancestry corresponds perfectly with Afro-Asiatic populations, as we can see right here. Here are the Afro-Asiatic peoples of the world, most Afro-Asiatic peoples, a good chunk of them being Semites, and we see that Natufian ancestry overlaps perfectly with Afro-Asiatic peoples. So what modern Semitic population has the highest Natufian ancestry? That's the real question we need to ask ourselves. What Semitic population today has the highest Natufian ancestry? Well, Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemeni actually have the highest Natufian ancestry among Semitic groups. But not only that, but these populations also carry haplogroup E. So this is from the Genomic History of the Middle East, and it reads, Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines. Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines. When we substitute Levant Neolithic with Natufians as source of ancestry in the Middle East, we found that Arabians could be successfully modeled. Arabians require additional ancestry from a Natufian-related population. And so here is all the E samples we find in the Middle East. And as you can see down here in the red and blue, we have a lot of who? Yemeni, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Yemeni, Syrian, Yemeni, Saudi Arabia. And it's all throughout. You have just going to focus on the Yemeni samples because you also have, Bedouins in Israel, but our focus is more so. Well, Bedouins also have a lot of Natufian ancestry. So Bedouins from Israel Negev, and then you have Arab Christians in Israel, and you have Iraqi people, Yemeni, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Yemen. So our main focus is on Yemen and Saudi Arabia and such, and Bedouins. And they most definitely have haplogroup E among them in a very decent percentage. This is from Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern-Day Arabians and Iraqis, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human populations, and it reads, modern Saudi Arabian and Yemeni samples clustered tightly in the lower left quadrant, overlapping with the 3 Natufian samples, and were close to the Levant PPNB through PPNC and Levant Bronze Age samples. And that's basically everything we just covered. These Arabians and Yemenis, they're genetically connected to Natufian samples and to Levant PPNB, PPNC, and Levant Bronze Age samples. They have the closest connection to those ancient populations. So here is just an example of that. Yemen and Saudi Arabia, this light green is Levant PPNB. Then we know PPNB, Levant PPNB were the people who were the first pastoralists and agriculturalists, and they have up to around 50 to 60% of it. So that's very interesting. Also, people in Oman and the United Arab Emirates have Levantine PPNB. And just to show you more tables of this, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Oman, United Arab Emirates, they have this Natufian ancestry and Ibero-Mauritian ancestry. We see a lot of this Ibero-Mauritian and Natufian ancestry all throughout the Arabian Peninsula. All these populations have it. Again, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, they have Natufian and Ibero-Mauritian ancestry, basically Afro-Asiatic ancestry. These were the first peoples to speak Afro-Asiatic languages. So 3 of the individuals, this is from DNA Consultants, 3 of the individuals had Y chromosomes belonging to haplogroup E1b, which likely originated in East Africa and is also found in early Neolithic farmers from Jordan. Natufian genomes also show similarity to modern-day populations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Bedouin nomadic peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. So again, Natufians, they have haplogroup E. Of course, we know this. Early Neolithic farmers from the Jordan. But the main point is this. Natufian genomes, when it comes to modern populations, is closest to Saudi Arabia people of the Bedouin stock. Saudi Arabians who are Bedouins, these nomadic people of the Arabian Peninsula. And so just to show you that, here are actual samples taken from GEDmatch, put into Vahadu, that breaks down their DNA. And so we can see that in Yemenite people and Damhar, and forgive me for any of my mispronunciations, but the Yemenite people in Damhar, Yemenites in Amran, Yemenites in Al Jofra, Yemenite in Al Beda, and Yemenites in Mahara, they have up to 63% of Levant Natufian ancestry, 57% Levant Natufian ancestry, 65% Levant Natufian ancestry, 64% Levant Natufian ancestry, 71% Levant Natufian ancestry. A lot of Yemenites and Bedouins and Arabians with this Natufian ancestry, they are quite almost nearly Natufian. They're almost basically like modern day Natufians. Here are some more. Sadi, 68.0%, or basically 68% Levant Natufian. Bedouin B, 69% Levant Natufian. Yemenite and Ha-Rab, 64% Levant Natufian. Yemenite Jew, 63% Levant Natufian. Again, very high percentages of Levant Natufian ancestry within these people. And here's Bedouin A, Levant Natufian at 41%. Very decent percentages. And this is, again, the Levant and Arabia is where we find some of the oldest E markers, by the way. This is from carriers of mitochondrial DNA, microhaplogroup L3, basal lineages, migrated back to Africa from Asia around 70,000 years ago. And it reads, curiously, ancestral E star lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. And that star, by the way, stands for basal. Basically, very, very old E lineages. So I'm going to read that again. Ancestral E basal lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. So you do find old clades of E in Arabia and the Levant. And when it comes to these Yemenite populations and Bedouin populations and Arabian populations who are genetically closest to the Natufians, the Levant Natufians, their genetic distance, what's interesting about them is that they also happen to have quite a bit of haplogroup E among them. They have around 25% to 50% of haplogroup E among them. And here's actually a chart that shows the haplogroup E among Arabians. So they have a very, very decent percentage of haplogroup E. Well, Yemenites, Arabians, and Bedouins. And it's the exact same populations like Yemenite Damhar at 50%, and just other places. I'm not going to name these places again because I don't want to butcher the names, but a lot of the same Yemenites with the Natufian ancestry have haplogroup E. And that would make sense because their haplogroup E, their version of it, is actually a downstream of the Natufians. And Natufian ancestry, highest in the Middle East, and it expands outwards into the Mediterranean and into Africa. So Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemeni would be the closest modern population to Proto-Semites. This makes sense because when Proto-Semites began to leave the Levant, the southern branch of Semitic migrated from the Levant into the Arabian desert. And basically in the Arabian desert, they could have gotten genetically isolated to a certain extent. Therefore, they would retain a more pure form of the Semitic genome. This is from the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East, and it reads, Within South Semitic, the early emergence of a South Arabian lineage between approximately 3,300 and 6,250 years before present may reflect an early Bronze Age expansion of Semitic from the Levant southward into the Arabian desert. So we see right here that early Semites migrating from the location of the Levant southwards into the Arabian desert. The recurrent spread of early Semitic peoples and their languages into the steppe and the desert lands of the Arabian peninsula, combined with the biblical testimony on early Hebrew subsistence, led us to propose that the early West Semitic society may have had a largely pastoralist economy, partially adapted to such conditions. And of course, we talked about pastoralism and Semites. That makes a lot of sense. But the main thing I want to get is this: is that Semites migrated, well, South Semites or South Semitic migrated from the Levant into the Arabian desert southwards. And here's the migration, by the way. You have ancestral Semitic, of course, 4000 BC, 6000 years before present in the Levant, because Semites are a Levantine people in origin. They migrate from the Levant into Arabia, and they go, all throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And this would make sense why Yemenites, Bedouins, and Arabians, these Semitic peoples, these South Semitic peoples, have this Natufian ancestry because, well, where are Semites coming from? They're coming from the homeland of Natufians in the Levant. So this is why they have this ancestry at such a high percentage, as well as E-markers. Now, when it comes to Natufian ancestry, what I find fascinating about its distribution is that out of all of the other Afro-Asiatic populations in the world, it's really the Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemenis that have it the highest, that have it at the most. It's really the Semitic people who have the highest Natufian ancestry versus other Afro-Asiatic populations. And I think that's very, very fascinating and something important to keep in mind. So here again is the distribution of Natufian ancestry. And as we can see, its highest distribution and concentration is in the Middle East. And then it expands outwards into Africa and into the Mediterranean and other areas. So really, the Natufian ancestry is definitely highest among Semitic people versus other Afro-Asiatic people. With that being said, it is still seen in other Afro-Asiatic peoples, don't get me wrong, but it is highest in the Semites, and I think that's very important to note. As you can see, even with the distance chart, you can see that it's highest among the Arabians and the Yemenites and the Bedouins. Then it goes into the North African populations and such, and other Afro-Asiatic populations. So Yemenis and Saudis have between 57% and 71% of Natufian-related ancestry, and among them, the Mahari from Yemen should be highlighted, with 71% of Natufian-like ancestry, which makes them the most Natufian-like people in the modern world. Some Bedouin groups from the vicinity of the Negev and Sinai have 69% of that kind of ancestry, while other Middle Eastern groups or Middle Eastern Bedouins are much more mixed and have only 41% of it. So when it comes to basically Saudi Arabians and Yemenis and Bedouins, they have a very decent percentage. Yemenis and Saudis having perhaps the highest. But here's the next population that I'll get into. The Egyptians and Libyans also have much of that ancestry, respectively, from 40% and 36%. So again, like I said, it's the Semitic populations that have the Natufian ancestry the most, and then it goes into other Afro-Asiatic populations. So just to show you those other Afro-Asiatic populations, you have the Libyans, who have 35% of Levant Natufian ancestry. Then you have the Egyptians with Levant Natufian ancestry at 39%. Then you have the Berber Tunisian peoples, who have 25% of Levant Natufian ancestry. So there is Levant Natufian ancestry, of course, in all Afro-Asiatic populations, but I just want to show you that it's highest in the Semitic. So Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemeni aren't the only Semitic populations, by the way, with Natufian ancestry. I want to make that clear. Samaritans in Israel, Jordanians, and Palestinians also have Natufian ancestry, and of course they also carry haplogroup E. So here it is right here, Palestinians, Jordanians, and Samaritans. Our focus is going to be on the Samaritans. The biggest and most important Samaritan family, the Kohan family, tradition tribe of Levi, was found to belong to haplogroup E. So, again, that's very interesting because Natufians, of course, had haplogroup E. Samaritans have a very close genetic connection to the Natufians, so it kind of all lines up. So here are Samaritan Levites. They have 100% of haplogroup E. Arabs in Egypt, Egyptian Arabs, or Arabs in Egypt, they have around 36% to 62% of haplogroup E. So they have a decent percentage of haplogroup E, and that's perhaps why we see that Levantine Neolithic DNA in Egypt. And then we have the Palestinian Arabs, because of course Palestinian is the next group. They have 31% of haplogroup E, and Arabs in the Jordan of the Dead Sea also have 31% of haplogroup E. So, and we see that Palestinians, Jordanians, and Samaritans, they all have haplogroup E. It's not like these populations don't have haplogroup E. They have it. It is their Y chromosome, and they also are genetically close to Levantine Natufians based on the chart. So it's very interesting. It's not just Yemenis that have this. It's not just Yemenis and Bedouins and Saudis that have this Natufian ancestry from the Semitic-speaking peoples. It's other Semitic peoples as well, like in the Levant, Samaritans, Jordanians, and Palestinians. And there's also Jews that have it as well. But returning back to the population with the highest Natufian ancestry, let's just focus on them. It would seem like southern Semitic populations retained the purest form of the Semitic/Afro-Asiatic genome, i.e. Natufian ancestry, due to their isolation in the Arabian deserts, and perhaps because they're nomads, they're always traveling, so they have a less time to mix. They also would have the oldest E markers as well, which is linked to the Natufians. They have basically downstream markers of what the Natufians had. Again, Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines. Saudi Arabian and Yemeni samples clustered tightly in the lower left quadrant, overlapping with the three Natufian samples, and were close to the Levant's PPN-B, PPN-C, and Levant Bronze Age samples. Three of the individuals had Y chromosomes belonging to haplogroup E1b1, which likely originated in East Africa and is also found in early Neolithic farmers of Jordan. Natufian genomes also show similarity to modern-day populations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Bedouin nomadic peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. Curiously, ancestral E-star lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. Within South Semitic, the early emergence of a South Arabian lineage between approximately 3,300 and 6,250 years before present may reflect an early Bronze Age expansion of Semitic from the Levant southward to the Arabian desert. And again, culminating all of this together, it kind of makes sense why the Yemenites, Arabians, and Bedouins would have this Natufian ancestry. They are a population of people who left the Levant. They are the southern branch of Semites. They left the Levant, went into the deserts of Arabia, became isolated, therefore having the highest amount of Natufian DNA and having some of the oldest clades of haplogroup E as well. So it all culminates together. These groups, Yemenites, Bedouins, and Arabians, would be the closest people genetically to the Proto-Semitic population due to their isolation. And again, the Natufian ancestry expands out of the Middle East into Africa and the Mediterranean. And it is the Semitic peoples who have this highest Natufian ancestry. I would say from a phenotype perspective that Arabians and Bedouins and Yemeni have the closest phenotype to an early ancient Proto-Semite, genetically speaking. I would say they have the closest phenotype to an early ancient Proto-Semite. So what is that phenotype? This is the book The Arabs that actually deals with the original phenotype of the Arabian population, and it reads, the original inhabitants of Arabia then, according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists, who has made a study of Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a very much darker people. A Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world from Africa to Malaysia, giving rise to the Hamitic peoples of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. So the Arabian population was, in the past, far more darker and even Proto-Negroid-like in appearance. This is from the book The Negro in the New World. It is quite conceivable that a great peninsula of Arabia was once populated, as far as its natural conditions allowed, by a primitive Negro stock. So again, ancient Arabia seemed to have phenotypically been more Negroid in stock. And this is the travelers to the Middle East, from Bertrand Hart to Thresher. Excuse me for mispronunciations. But talking about Arabia, it says the people of Arabia belong to two distinct and apparently quite different races. The Arabs of South Arabia are smaller, darker, coarser featured, and nearly beardless. All authorities agree that the Southern Arabians are nearly related by origin to the Abyssinians. And of course, the South Arabians are the most important people to study for our research, because the South Arabians are the ones with this Natufian ancestry and with these E markers. So, again, South Arabians, good example. This is from the book Racial Types from South Arabia. Racial affinities of the South Arab lie in northeast Africa. A Negroid strain occurs in the belt from Africa through South Arabia to Malaysia, including the Dravidians of South India. So again, South Arabians, they basically look like Northeast Africans. They look like Dravidians. They look like what they say, a Negroid strain of people. Henry Field, in his Ancient and Modern Man in Southwest Asia, argues as well, Dravidian and Arab have in them an inheritance from a common stock, an inheritance which has been retained more completely by the natives of India than by the people of Arabia. Marshall's and von Herensfeld's remarkable insight has the support of contemporary ethnography and modern genetic research. Sir Arthur Keith and Dr. Wilton Moran Corgan, in their discussion of the racial characteristic of the Southern Arabs, the Arabian Peninsula was at one time occupied by a people intermediate to the Somalis on the one hand and to the Dravidian peoples of India on the other. So basically, what these what these anthropologists in general are saying is that the Arabians, South Arabians, the original inhabitants of Arabia, they look like people that were either like Dravidian, and here's at the top is really old depictions of Dravidians from the 18th century, and then down below is a Somali. So they look something like that. Basically, they would have been like black skinned, dark skinned, with this type of Afro hair style, Afro hair texture. So that's what Arabians would have looked like. So with that being said, let's just look at some depictions of Arabians. So here are Arabians again, Arabians, Yemenis, Bedouins. These are the peoples who I believe early Proto-Semitic peoples would have looked like. This right here, by the way, is a archaeologist that took a photo with them. And these are, some good examples of what, early Proto-Semitic populations could have looked like. Here are some captured or enslaved South Arabian peoples by the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks were in Arabia, and they did the Bedouin people very, very badly. And here are just like some different Yemeni and Arabian and Bedouin peoples, and clearly these are the darker skinned peoples of the Middle East, the Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemenis of the desert. And to this day, they still reside in the desert. A lot of different just Yemeni peoples, Bedouins, and Arabians and such, all within the Middle East. So there are definitely still dark-skinned Middle Easterners to this day there, and they definitely should be highlighted. And these peoples, keep in mind, have the highest amount of Natufian ancestry. So looking at them, to a certain extent, is almost like looking at a Natufian. Not 100%, but to a certain extent. Yemenis and Bedouins and Arabians still have a little bit of mixture from other groups, but still they represent a pretty decent modern representation within the flesh. So this is how I believe early Proto-Semitic populations could have looked, having these various phenotypes, because these people have different phenotypes, but they're all still basically dark brown-skinned people. And I rock with all the different structures of the face that they have. But this is basically what I would consider to be an early Proto-Semite, what an early Semitic person, descendants of Shem, if we're going to go biblical, would look like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc. So these Bedouins, Arabians, and Yemeni phenotypes, to me, best display what a Proto-Semitic person would look like. And they would seem to fit even the ancient descriptions of Semites as well. Keep in mind, this is how ancient Semites depicted themselves, or how people depicted them. Here are just Akkadians from Mari, the depictions of them. They look like those images of those men and women and families that I showed earlier. Here are Elamites. They also look very the same like the images of people I showed. This is a Syrian man and a Syrian wife and child. These are Arameans in Syria. This is another Akkadian, and these are right here. These are specifically Chaldeans, and these are very interesting Semitic people as well that I'll get into in the future. But just overall, in the past, ancient Semitic populations definitely were dark skinned, no different than how the modern ones are. And with them descending from Natufians, that would make sense, because what is the genetic makeup of Natufian? 60% Arabian, 20% North African, Ibero-Mauritian, and 6.8% Omotic ancestry. You blend all this together, you're going to get a dark-skinned looking population of people. And if Semites come from Natufians with this type of genetic makeup, then it makes sense why they would look the way they look. So, and again, here's a reconstruction of a Natufian in the flesh, and he would be a dark brown-skinned man, dark eyes, and his hair, I believe, would be a little bit more curly though. But he would fit in right along with Bedouins and Arabians and Yemeni people, because he is their ancestor. So, conclusion. The modern population closest to Proto-Semitic peoples would be Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemenis populations with Natufian/Ibero-Mauritian ancestry and haplogroup E. And this is where I end genetically what modern population is closest to Proto-Semites. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe, share the video, click the bell, and leave a comment for any questions you might have, and follow my social media platforms that you are about to see. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day, and shalom.